Today I would like to give you the fourth commandment. We've studied commandments 1 and 2, and the last time commandment number 3. And so today we come to the fourth commandment. Of course, that's not a new topic, I'm sure, for any of you. But unfortunately, not everyone is getting out of the Sabbath what is possible. And so it's good for us to examine this commandment and what it actually means. In Exodus 20, verses 8 to 11, we read, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy." Unfortunately, as we look at the history of God's people, they forgot more than they remembered. And God knew that this would be a problem. So in this particular rendition of the fourth commandment, it starts out with that word, remember. That applies to all the future. And of course, it also applies to the past, but we can't change the past. So he's asking us from now on until Jesus comes to remember and to make sure that we keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. If we can't get it done in 6 days, we don't do it. Only 6 days have been given, and we can't leave the leftovers to Sabbath and finish up on Sabbath. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. So if we run a business, it's not appropriate to have our employees work on Sabbath. We have to require all. And you probably have heard of Denzel McNeilus, but he runs a group of banks. They used to be, and he worked with his father making garbage trucks and cement mixers. And you'll see sometimes as you're driving down the highway on the mud flap, McNeilus. Well, that was what they did until he went into banking. But they have always instructed their employees that nobody works on Sabbath. And if there's anyone in your home, then they are to keep the Sabbath also, at least as far as not working on that day. And then it gives the reason why this should be done. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. If God can get done everything he needs to do in 6 days, then we ought to be able to do the same. We have a lot less responsibility. And so he puts down that the reason of asking you to rest on the seventh day is because I did, and because it is a memorial of creation. And then, of course, we know that later it became a memorial of redemption as well, because the only full day that Jesus rested was on Sabbath after he died. He rested that whole day in the tomb. So he rested after creation, and he rested after he redeemed man. Now some get the idea that this is a Jewish thing, And I believe Satan is behind that, trying to create the idea that it was Jewish, because in general, there's not a real good attitude toward Jews. This country's not too bad, but some countries really hate the Jews, and we know what happened in Hitler's time. And so it puts a negative idea on the Sabbath when people try to say it's Jewish. But notice in Genesis 2, verses 2 and 3, it says, "On the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made." Now, as we look at this text, we see that it was for the whole human race. It wasn't just for the Jews. It was for the entire race. Adam and Eve were given the Sabbath immediately after they were created, and they kept their first Sabbath there in the Garden of Eden. And there are three words here that are mentioned which are very important. Why did he give us the Sabbath? Number one, to rest. We can get more done in 6 days if we rest one day than if we work all 7. And people find that out, sometimes not even religious people. They work 7 days a week, and eventually it catches up to them, and they're not able to function well, or they have a complete collapse, and so on. So it has been proven by scientific research, as well as what the Bible says, that you need to rest on the Sabbath. Now also, it mentions that God blessed the seventh day. Now there's a lot of people today that think, well, as long as you rest 1 and 7, it doesn't really matter. But you know what? God blessed only one. He didn't bless Sunday. He didn't bless Monday. He didn't bless Tuesday. And we could go through the rest of the week. He didn't bless those days. The only day he blessed was the seventh-day Sabbath. And I have had the privilege of studying with a number of people who learned about the Sabbath and learned about the other truths we share. And some of them have told me, you know what? I get a much bigger blessing when I rest on the Sabbath than I ever did from resting on Sunday. Why is that? It tells us the answer right here. God put a blessing on that day. And to get the blessing, we have to rest according to what he said. And then we will get the blessing. I have experienced it myself. I read and study every day of the week. But I notice that when I study on Sabbath, I always get more blessings from it. And it's like there's a double blessing that rests upon Sabbath study. Now, you would think humanly that what difference does it make what day you're studying? You're studying the inspired writings. It should be the same every day, but it's not. The Sabbath is different because God blessed that day. He also sanctified that day. He made it holy time. Now, going back to the blessed, when you look up the original word, it doesn't mean the same as us. So maybe the comments should be that I just gave should be attached to sanctified. It's holy time, and that's why we get the blessing. But the blessing, the root word means to kneel or to worship. And so what that is telling us is that God set aside the seventh day for the day of worship, to, bow down before him, to have services to where we worship him, that is the purpose of that day. And that's what Adam and Eve did in the beginning. That was what was done by the faithful ones all the way until Mount Sinai. And the reason why Mount Sinai occurred and why God gave the commandments is because they had been forgetting them. And he had to bring that knowledge back to them, and especially to get the Sabbath well established in their mind. Now, he gave some instructions in regard to how we should keep the Sabbath. What is the kind of rest that he's really calling upon us to have? In Exodus 16, verse 23, it says, "And he said unto them, This is that which the Lord has said. Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord." Now, you have to keep in mind this is before Sinai. Therefore, we know that Moses was aware of the importance of keeping the Sabbath. In fact, if we look a little bit earlier, we discover that Moses, when he went back to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt, he told them, how do you expect deliverance if you're not keeping the Sabbath? That's an important lesson. Jesus is to come soon to deliver us from this earth. How can we expect to be delivered from this earth if we're not keeping the Sabbath? We can't. Well, the king got really angry because they were resting on the Sabbath. Previously, they hadn't been, and so it made quite a stir. Then, after the Israelites were out of Egypt, heading toward the promised land, Moses said, "Now, tomorrow is the Sabbath, and here's some instructions. Bake that which ye will bake today, and see that ye will seethe," or in other words, boil what you're going to boil, "and that which remaineth over, lay up for you to be kept until the morning." So a very clear instruction in the Bible. No baking on Sabbath, no boiling on Sabbath, which obviously means that the food has to be prepared ahead of time. On Friday, the food is prepared. Now, we do have evidence that we don't have to eat cold food on Sabbath, that it can be heated up, but it is to be prepared. And some of the modern conveniences that we have today have caused a lot of people to think that this doesn't matter anymore, and they ignore the instruction. But there's nowhere that I've read where it's been removed. It's still there. It's still for us today. Now, in trying to think over why would God give us some of these detailed instructions? What is the purpose? Today you can put it in a microwave and in seconds it'll be done, and various other devices that we have, and people think it's a time issue. I don't think that's all that is involved in this, not just a time issue. But God is asking us to push everything off the Sabbath that we can push off of it. Why? Because all day we are to have a relationship with Him all day long. And so anytime we can find a way to reduce anything that would have to be done on Sabbath. There are things that have to be done. If you have a dairy herd, you have to milk the cows. You can't ignore them on Sabbath. If we have sick people to take care of, we can't ignore them on Sabbath. So there are things we can't push off the Sabbath, but anything that we can push to Friday or Sunday, that's what He asks us to do. so that we have time. The problem today in many circles, I trust it's not a problem here, is that about the only thing that people have time to do is to go to church on Sabbath. You don't have time to get to Sabbath school because they're too tired or whatever. And after dinner, they have to sleep because they're so tired. And so the Sabbath goes by, and about the only time they had with God was during the church service. That's not what he had in mind. He had in mind that from the moment we get up in the morning until the sun goes down, that we're going to be having a time with him. And it will determine how the whole next week will go, how much time we had with him. And so he's calling us, listen, I want to have time with you on the Sabbath. You know, I didn't have a problem when I was courting my wife to want to spend time with her. And in fact, she didn't even have to ask me to spend time with her. I was looking for ways to have time with her. And I still enjoy that very much. But how come? How come we're not eager to have more time with God? That's what he set the Sabbath up for. And therefore, we need to find ways to have it and to push everything off that we can. In Patriarchs and Prophets, page 307, it gives a little expansion of this subject. The Sabbath is not introduced as a new institution, but as having been founded at creation. It is to be remembered and observed as the memorial of the Creator's work. Now, of course, what do? Not just be remembering that creation occurred, but we have a lot of things that come to us through what he created. Many blessings. And he wants us to enjoy what he created. And so we can spend time in nature, witnessing, seeing. And I noticed many times that when we went out in nature, God would draw our attention to something very special that we hadn't seen before out there in nature. And so it's a time to praise God and to thank him for all the things that he created. Really, what would man do if he didn't create anything but us? We'd be in a real fix. The houses we build comes from what he created. The beauty that we watch is all created by him. There should be a lot of praise ascending to God every Sabbath for what he has done as the creator. Pointing to God as the maker of the heavens and the earth, it distinguishes the true God from all false gods. Amen. No other God can create, only the true God. And so when we keep the Sabbath, we cannot become an idolater. That is, if we keep it right. We cannot. Because he has been so good and blessed so abundantly. All who keep the seventh day signify by this act that they are worshipers of Jehovah. Now, of course, God always makes allowance for ignorance. If people don't know, he will give them a blessing. He can't give them as much, though, I don't believe. But he gives them a blessing. But if we do know that the Sabbath is to be kept, then if we don't keep it, we're really not worshiping God. All who keep the seventh day signify by this act that they are worshipers of Jehovah. That we serve the true God. We do what he said, not what the Pope said that we're to do, or some other spiritual leader. We don't do that. We do what the true God has told us to do. Thus, the Sabbath is a sign of man's allegiance to God as long as there are any upon the earth to serve him. So when your neighbors see you go out of your house dressed in Sabbath clothes, and they get the idea that you're going to church, now you are a sign to them that they too should be considering the Sabbath. And it's a sign in many, many different ways that God has given us this day, because he is looking for worshipers, not because he's selfish, but because he knows what he can do for his worshipers, and he wants to bless humans. The fourth commandment is the only one of all the 10 in which are found both the name and the title of the lawgiver. So if we took out the fourth commandment, we wouldn't know who told us to do these things. And if you notice, most listings of the 10 commandments take it out. And for the fourth commandment, they just say keep the Sabbath, and they don't put the rest of it. Well, that's removing these things, the name and the title and whose authority is being given. There's a reason why he put that in the fourth commandment. He didn't put it in the third or the fifth or any place else. He put it in the fourth, because this is the one that makes us a sign of being his followers. It is the only one that shows by whose authority the law is given. Thus it contains the seal of God, affixed to his law as evidence of its authenticity and binding force. In Revelation, we won't read it, but we see in chapter 7, we see the angels about ready to loosen the winds of strife and allow the 7 last plagues to fall upon the earth. But another angel messenger says, don't do it. Hold on until I get everyone sealed, and then the 7 last plagues can fall. Well, what is that seal? It's the Sabbath. It's more than that, but that is the primary aspect. Those that want to go to heaven have to get ready to keep the Sabbath and to be sealed. Otherwise, they cannot be delivered out of this earth. If this is now from Isaiah 58, verses 13 and 14, again, helping us to understand how. How is the Sabbath to be kept? If thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, in other words, if you stop stepping on the Sabbath by neglecting to do what he asked us to do, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day. Now that doesn't mean that what we do on Sabbath cannot be pleasurable, but he's talking about things that are pleasurable other days of the week, that we shouldn't do that on Sabbath. And call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, honorable, and shall honor him. And then it breaks it down. Not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words. Now, as I grew up as a young man in a large Adventist center in Tacoma Park, Maryland, actually I didn't have my childhood years there, but I had my school, college years there. I noticed something about most Adventists. They were, first of all, they called it lay activities, and they would take a long nap after dinner. Now, the older you get, you may have to have some nap after dinner, but it's not best to do it immediately after dinner. So they would have their lay activities, and then if you were with them toward the end of the Sabbath, they would look at their clock. No, it's not over yet. They were, hoping that Sabbath would get over and they could do some fun things and some enjoyable things once the Sabbath was over. I was probably not where they were, but I wasn't where I should have been at that time either. And usually what the school had after Sabbath went down was a movie for everybody to come and watch, or maybe a talent show or something. And so to them, that was much more exciting to do that than the Sabbath. But that's not the wording here. It says that we should call the Sabbath a delight. Now, does he want us to lie? No. So apparently, true Sabbath keeping makes the Sabbath a delight. The best day of the week. The one that we look forward to all week long. And so if Sabbath is not a delight, we're missing something. We're not really catching the purpose of the Sabbath day. And the purpose, as I understand it, is to develop further our relationship with Jesus. And to do those things and read those things and pray and share maybe whatever helps us to grow in our Christian experience with Him. That is what we do on that day. And then once we obtain a delight of those things, now we think the exact opposite. We start thinking, is Sabbath here yet? No, it's not quite here yet. And during the Sabbath, we're not eager for it to get over. We feel sad when it's over because the press of all the things we've got to do are back on us again, and we've got to accomplish all that. But we get a rest from all that during the Sabbath. In fact, in the summertime, I sort of like to make believe it's Sabbath till bedtime and not enter back into the other things, because it's not very long anyway, till a proper bedtime. Then it finishes with this: then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord. And here's true Sabbath keeping, what it does. And I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it. Maybe sometime we can study what it means when he says that we will ride upon the high places of the earth, and he will feed us with the heritage of Jacob thy father. But you can tell it's a special blessing that's going to come when Sabbath is kept the way he asks us to keep it. Patriarchs and Prophets 3:07. God has given me 6 days wherein to labor, and he requires that their own work be done in the 6 working days. So, on one hand, he says, you need to rest on the Sabbath. On the other hand, he says, you need to work on the 6 days. Now, we had a pastor at Wildwood one time that felt the institution should have people's work 6 days a week. I didn't agree with that, because we do have some things around our homes that have to be done. And so we work 5 days for the institution, and we work 1 day for ourselves, but it's 6 days for work. However, acts of necessity and mercy are permitted on the Sabbath. Now, I'll have to object to some of what is being done on the Sabbath some places today. I don't think it's appropriate to go and put a roof on someone's house on Sabbath. True, they need a roof, but I don't think that's the day to do it. We need to do that during the 6 working days. And there are various other things that are sometimes done using this sentence to justify it. But I think if we look at it carefully, it is not allowing that type of thing to be done. Yes, if somebody is drowning, we can rescue them on Sabbath. If they are sick, we can give them a treatment on Sabbath. We can do those things that qualify as a true necessity or a mercy that will ease their pain and their suffering. We can do that on Sabbath. And then it names the sick. The sick and suffering are at all times to be cared for. But now that gets pushed too far, and some people work every Sabbath because they're a nurse or a doctor, but I have read some cautions that it's not good for that to be. They shouldn't have to work every Sabbath. We need to find a way to share the work so that we don't have to work every Sabbath. But unnecessary labor is to be strictly avoided. Here's another one. Those who discuss business matters or lay plans on the Sabbath are regarded by God as though engaged in the actual transaction of business. This is a big weakness in many places where I visited on Sabbath to discuss business plans. And one time I was talking to a mechanic that we had at Wildwood, and he said to me, he said, Pastor Atwood, you're the only one that doesn't talk to me about your car problems on Sabbath. And I thought, poor guy. I mean, why can't people give him rest on the Sabbath from their car problems? Now, of course, if you're going to a speaking appointment and your car breaks down, that's a different story. But most of our car problems do not have to be discussed on Sabbath. So there's probably some coming up to do for many. And I don't know whether there's any here that need it or not. But we need to watch what we talk about on Sabbath. I think the problem boils down to that we are not as interested in spiritual things as we ought to be. And so we have trouble spending a whole day where the only thing we talk about is spiritual things or, things that will help our church to advance in missionary work and things that are connected with this type of topic. We don't have enough interest in that because, when people are in love, that's about the only thing they can talk about, it seems like. And whoever you are, they're going to talk to you about something in regard to their love experience. So I think instead of pulling the leaves off the tree, and saying, well, I better not do this and better not do that on the Sabbath and so on, what we really need to work on is our relationship with Jesus so that we don't have time on Sabbath to talk about those things. To keep the Sabbath holy, we should not even allow our minds to dwell upon things of a worldly character. And the commandment includes all within our gates. The inmates of the house are to lay aside their worldly business during the sacred hours. All should unite to honor God by willing service upon His holy day. So that's where we have to control in the mind that we train our mind to push out those things that don't belong on the Sabbath. And if we work at it, especially in our relationship with Jesus, then it becomes a powerful instrument to push those things out because we're more eager to be thinking and talking about these things that belong to the Sabbath. Here's another very important one, I believe, 6 Testimonies 3:54. When the Sabbath is remembered, the temporal will not be allowed to encroach upon the spiritual. No duty pertaining to the 6 working days will be left for the Sabbath. Now, what do we do if we can't get it all done before Sabbath? We wait until Sabbath is over. That's very hard for many of us because we want to get it done. And maybe if your house is not clean, you'll feel embarrassed if somebody comes and it wasn't clean. But if it's not done by Sabbath, or really it's better a few moments before Sabbath, so that our mind can shift gears and get into the Sabbath mode, then we have to leave it undone. During the week, our energies will not be so exhausted in temporal labor that on the day when the Lord rested and was refreshed, we shall be too weary to engage in His service. Now that's a big one. Somebody mentioned in Sabbath school class that there's too much interest in our financial welfare in many people's experience today. Too much interest in that. And because of that, we get so tired with the duties that we have to do for ourselves, plus the duties we do to earn a living, that on Sabbath we're exhausted or we're worn out and we cannot receive the blessings that the Sabbath has to offer. That is not true Sabbath keeping. We have to find a way to cut back on the duties during the week so that we can get the blessing on Sabbath. And there's 2 aspects of it. The first is that when we're so tired, even though we go to religious services and maybe we study our Bible, we don't get much out of it because we're so tired and we miss it. And the second thing is that we start skipping some things because we're too tired. And all of that deprives us of getting the blessings that God had in mind. Also in 6 Testimonies, it says, many need instruction as to how they should appear in the assembly for worship on the Sabbath. Now, I have seen people come to church that were not of our faith in some clothing and they got rebuked by someone. This is not what God is asking for. We should be glad they came no matter what they're wearing in that situation. But for those of us that understand the Sabbath, this is important. It says they are not to enter the presence of God in the common clothing worn during the week. All should have a special Sabbath suit to be worn when attending service in God's house. While we should not conform to worldly fashions, we are not to be indifferent in regard to our outward appearance. We are to be neat and trim, though without adornment. The children of God should be pure within and without. So true Sabbath keeping affects even how we dress. And, you know, for a number of years, there has been a steady move called dressing down. In other words, the kind of clothing that people wear all during the week, they wear the same clothing to church. And this is not appropriate for true Sabbath keeping. We should have something, calls it a suit here, but doesn't necessarily mean what we mean when we call it a suit. Special dress, special clothes that we use for Sabbath that look better than many of the things that we wear during the week. Why? Because we're coming to meet with the King of the universe. Even if we were to visit some dignitary on earth, we would be careful about how we dress. You know, we wouldn't wear jeans and a t-shirt to come into their presence. Although that is probably the main clothing that people wear all during the week now. And some think that it's fine to come to church that way. But God says, no, you need to have special clothing to come and meet. On Friday, let the preparation for the Sabbath be completed. See that all the clothing is in readiness and that all the cooking is done. In other words, you need to check, because we might get up Sabbath morning, if we haven't checked, a button is missing. Well, we don't want to go without the button, or something else that's dirty and so on. So we need to know ahead of time that our clothing is ready and that all the cooking is done. Let the boots be blacked and the baths be taken. It is possible to do this. I thought it was interesting that God has to say, it is possible to do this, because many would say, no, we can't get all that done. If you make it a rule, you can do it. The Sabbath is not to be given to the repairing of garments, to the cooking of food, to pleasure seeking, or to any other worldly employment. Now, again, we have a difference of opinion about this, and I'm not interested in arguing about where it says baths should be taken before Sabbath. But that's what it says, and I just call our attention to it, that it is possible to do that, and that God is asking us to do that. He gets down to the very small details in trying to help us see how to keep the Sabbath. This last one comes also from 6 Testimonies. Before the setting of the sun, let all secular work be laid aside, and all secular papers be put out of sight. If we don't do that, then we'll notice something in the newspaper and it'll start our mind going, or news magazine, or some other, whirly paper that's on our coffee table or somewhere. So we put those out of sight, and that helps us to think the way we should. Parents, explain your work and its purpose to your children, and let them share in your preparation to keep the Sabbath according to the commandment. On Sabbath morning, the family should be astir, what? Early. Most Seventh-day Adventists see Sabbath as a day to sleep in. But God says, no, that's not the day to sleep in. Sleep in Sunday morning, on your day of work. Don't sleep on my day. Sleep in Sunday or Monday or whatever, but don't sleep in on my day. Here's what happens if we sleep in on Sabbath morning. If they rise late, there is confusion and bustle in preparing for breakfast and Sabbath school. There is hurrying, jostling, and impatience. So by the time we get to church, we're so frustrated at each other that we can't get the blessing that we're supposed to get on Sabbath. If we had gotten up early, then we would be on time. And you know what? It'd be nice to have more people here at 9 o'clock to pray. We have a prayer band at 9 o'clock to pray for this church service and for the Sabbath school service. Probably some people have a legitimate reason why they can't be here, and that's okay. But if we followed this advice of rising early, many more would be able to come and join us for that prayer. And I know God blesses because of that prayer. And the more people there, the more He will bless, I believe, the services that we have, and help us to taste the real purpose of Sabbath. So if there's any of that that calls for a change in your lifestyle, may God help you to find a way to do it. I'm not here to condemn you for what you did in the past, but simply to point us toward what can happen to us as full Sabbath keepers.